Hello everybody, XP Gamer here, and welcome back to another story video. So, for those of you who don't know, I write short stories about scenes in video games, specific scenes, just whatever I want to really. And today I'm going to be telling you a story I like to call Mournful Routine. It's a story I wrote about the Lanayru Sand Sea from the Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. And this is probably one of my favorites of mine, so I'm happy to share it with you today. So first off, it's a mix between Zelda and made up. So you'll see elements from the inspiration, but at the same time, a lot of the story is my own. And also, I took influence from a few Zelda quotes from the actual games, and then I took inspiration from this comment, which was actually left on a video of the Lanayru Sand Sea soundtrack, like the track that goes with the area in the game. So I just wanted to give credit to where I found inspiration. Other than that, the rest is just my own. I just kind of rolled with it, saw what happened, and I hope you enjoy the story. Mournful Routine. Time is a cruel thing. Its speed seems different for each individual, yet no one can change it. A thing that does not change with time is a memory of younger days. A memory of a brighter time. A time when things were better. A time when the troubles and worries of today's world were merely non-existent, waiting to reveal themselves to us at a later date. As the sun invaded the darkened sky at the 7th hour, a searing wind blew minute grains of monochrome sand randomly across the dusted peninsula before they settled just off the coast, in a massive sea of soot, trash, and misery. Alongside that, this same gust welcomed lethal waves of heat upon the homes of many, scorching their inhabitants. Likewise, when the moon crawled into the dead of night, driving out the sun's brilliant light, it brought with it a frigid gale, which instinctively frosted the gulf of sand, and pierced the same homes that had just concluded their battle against the day's heat. No matter when it came, the wind carried the same thing: death. The mornings were simple, just another struggle to wake up knowing the outside world had been so deprived of any lushness in nature it once bore. 2 torn, cracked boots had been occupied by weary feet, struggling to support the weight of the body they were cursed to carry. One after the other, slowly, unwillingly, the boots stumbled down a hallway of which the floor was undoubtedly ready to give in to years of pressure. The hardwood floors of the past had become limp and thin. As time passed, the planks grew farther apart, and sand nestled its way comfortably between the newborn crevices. The body struggled down the long hall, occasionally falling unintentionally against the walls to support itself, although the contact with the brittle drywall caused flakes of century-old paint to fall to the cragged floor in a slow, unpredictable manner. The poor leather toe of one of the boots met violently with the brittle leg of a splintered circular table, atop of which a dusty glass vase moved in circular patterns as it pondered over whether or not there was any reason not to fall anymore. The vase fell, bringing its usefulness to an end, as many other things in this decrepit world had done long before, including the contents of the shattered glass container, which were now unrecognizable flowers. They lay scattered around the broken shards of glass on the floor, petals resembling that of a rose but dead so long they could no longer be identified. Echoing through the drafty household, the sound of shattering glass sped out and faded into nothingness as it bounced against the useless corridors of the house, surrounded by many other useless houses, which themselves were filled with dozens of useless lives performing useless tasks in a useless, depressing, despair-filled, joy-ridden world. The sun was punishing the land, depriving it of what little sodden and fertile soils it had left, its golden rays swerving like a forest cobra through every inch of ground they could cover, their heat vaporizing any moisture within their grasp, bringing the planet's surface ever more similar to the asperity of a desert lizard's scale. The two boots still trudged on, now reaching the winding staircase of a 2-story home. Dust released itself from the soles of the feeble footwear that seemed to give off a humane moan of distress at the sight of this weak, rigid flight. The tops of the boots rubbed against the dispirited and severed dull brown cloth, making up the lean figure's loose pants as the first step was taken down the steep staircase. Another sound echoed throughout the useless house's folly, this time a creaking of anguish that screamed out from a thin crack in the dilapidated wood of the disheartened stairwell. The sound diminished, unnoticed, or maybe just ignored by the shaggy man whose shoes produced it, as he in his boots, in his loose, dangling pants, in his baggy shirt that was at one time a pristine white color, but was now tinted beige due to the accommodation of dust, moved on down the remaining steps of the demoralized household. The sun was now at its apex, and the heat striking the dirty land was now striking it at a straightforward angle. This was the most depressing part of the day, but was little more than dust in the wind in comparison to the freezing gales of the night. The staircase had been descended, and the monotone man proceeded, in his increasingly exhausted boots, toward the partially jammed door that concealed from the man's lost eyes, which, despite their host's dehydration, had been barely watering in a mostly faulty attempt to wash away the overwhelming particles of dust in the air. The same depressing and dying outside world that he had been exposed to daily for many years now. As the door became larger and larger through the man's offset gaze, a shriveled hand that appeared deceased reached sluggishly for the scratched brass knob of the door, disinterested in whether or not it would be able to muster enough strength to open it again. If the door opened, the man would carry on with his desolate daily routine, and if it did not, he would have no objections to slowly withering away of malnourishment within a week in the illusory comfort of his lackluster home. Now resting on the warm knob, the emaciated hand prepared to tug on the door. As it put the smattering of energy it had into this action, boiling veins appeared to almost tear through the dark, decomposing flesh that lay atop the struggling limb. Just as the man was about to neutrally accept that he had at last become too weak to escape the confinements of his own distraught home, the door swung frantically open. And just then, the despair managed to creep in, as the now expected sight of the world's hopeless state smugly greeted the man with a barrage of floating sand that set up comfortably in the mangled nest of hair that hung lowly off his frail chin. The outside world was as shrewd as the innards of the man's house, and not a living soul could be seen through the figure's misty eyes. Many houses stood, half-grounded, windows shattered, bricks fallen and piled up at the base of the depressing structures, watching their neighbors die off. Unlike the man in the matching but not remotely upbeat clothing, a majority of the other house's inhabitants had grown tired of the great waste of time that was their worthless, unredeeming lives, and had thus promptly ended them, and with their lives, the misery was cut off as well. But misery found a way. Misery still persisted, prominently, within lives of those like the man garbed in clothes that made him seem as though there was nothing left to live for. Remainders lumbered around the corpse of a planet like zombies, scavenging for minor moments of happiness, which were only existent within memories of the past. While humans suffered from their terrible self-inflicted fate, so too did the wildlife. As the boots carried their body closer to its death, they stepped on nary a patch of greenery walked past not a single towering tree nor flourishing flower. The world was devoid of anything but despair, sans anything but sadness. Insects grandly outnumbered their humane associates, but that was in the past. Now their microscopic organs had long been shut down, unable to adapt to the brilliant changes in temperature that came and went uninterrupted throughout the day. They were simply categorized as a thing of the past, as with most of the other animals, trees, flowers, lives across the planet. It wouldn't be long. Humans were next. They were a regressing species, but afraid to admit what they were all well aware of. Denial. The boots and pants and shirt and beard all marched forward in depressing unison, past nothing remarkable. Sand, soot, and silt all bombarded the shriveled man's battlefield of a face, invading dark, inexpressive eyes, distressing dried nostrils, slipping underneath lips that were cracked and similarly textured to limestone. And from there the little army of earth particles infested soon-to-collapse lungs. This compact war continued upon the man's countenance as he approached the once aquatic, unimaginable shore of what was, before, a vibrant, colorful, happy seaside town. But now that was all just a past memory. The vast sea was now a different kind of unimaginable. It was sand. A sea of sand. Instead of waves crashing into the shore with massive force, clumps of grainy, smashed earth oozed slowly towards it before sinking below, as more clumps lined up to repeat the sad process. Numerous minutes passed as the scrawny man stared out at the endless sea of humanity's damned actions, well aware of the sequence of events that occurred in order to dry the billions of gallons of beautiful ocean, yet inquiring anyways. The shifting particles emitted a quiet sound when slowly colliding with the dilapidated shoreline, and the gritty wind produced a similar sound as it swiftly passed through the innards of pipes of corroded metal machines which had long remained out of commission, and now lay, rejected and lonely, upon the shore. The boots had grown tired of remaining solitary in one place, and thus began transporting their scrawny body down the shoreline to an old rowboat, laying atop the coursing sea of crushed earth, its brown hue lightened and sapped from it as the result of sand viciously grating against its outer planks. The boat bobbed, unenthused, atop the sinking sea as the feeble figure stood before it. The dulled pants shifted and scrunched as the boots transferred them, and the whole body, complete with dusty shirt and a trashed straw hat concealing its wearer from the furious heat, into the risky boat. Now sitting inside the rocking wooden structure, the weakness of the man's limbs was ever more apparent, as his two trembling, parched hands were cut and bled as they untangled a frizzy rope that had been preventing the boat from being taken away by the boundless sea of shattered rock. The blood that bled was not runny, but oddly solidified. It was suffering from dehydration in harmony with the rest of the very body it coursed through. At last, with its threaded shackle released, the boat carried the drained frame away from his weakening mainland, which sat in turmoil, and adrift into the eternal body of sand, until both the boat and its contents became obscured within the foggy blanket of dust. Back on the coast, two still objects lay, intentionally left behind, and staying back with them was any glimmer of chance at clinging onto this damned world. Two oars were prostrate along the fading coast, now hundreds of feet away. Cruising on the vast sea of nothingness, The bearded man sat upon his vessel, unfazed by the lack of means to control his movement. Using what little energy he could find, the brittle hands pushed his carcass of a body to the side of the boat, disrupting its equilibrium. The hand slowly dipped itself into the rigid sea, searching for nourishment and hydration. The hand felt the rippling of crystalline, cool water, though it was not there. The vessel continued in its monotonous pace, as the hand continued to stroke the hallucinatory liquidity of the sand it was traveling across. It was warm, as sand should be, but it felt cool also. The past and present seemed to be flowing through the open palm, but this was false. The grip simply felt a memory of what once was, and what never will be again. The hand was dry, yet it felt wet. As the mistaken limb lifted itself cautiously out of the water, it felt the fluid dripping. It swore it felt it, but the man's cloudy gaze said otherwise, as the liquid was not seen. The fabric of time had been blurred to the elderly man's whim, as he cut off this vague remembrance. The straw hat hung low, as it concealed the body's distraught face. The croaking boat remained aloft upon the perpetual sea of desert quality. Peeking out of the shredded pocket of the man's pants, a crumpled paper sat, restless. It was snatched by a skinny hand before being brought within an uncomfortable distance of a pair of slightly misty eyes. While the sand and silt had permanently hindered the man's sight, he could still indistinctively make out 5 dark, but seemingly happy figures printed upon the yellowed paper. Although his sight remained limited, his mind had stayed sharp through the treacherous life he had lived, and he was aware of every detail that lay inscribed on the image. The poor state he was in had seized his human quality of crying. Otherwise, he might have. Energy was a scarce thing, but the carcass that encased the man possessed will. Using every bit of energy left in the rotting hands, the emaciated arms, and even the bone-dry legs, the forlorn man rocked the wooded boat to the right, then to the left. This motion was repeated as the man further exhausted himself. At last the boat flipped, spiraling onto its backside, leaving the dusted boots to fill up to their capacity in sand. The pants were enveloped in the sinking earth, followed by the dulled shirt, and eventually the gray, mangled beard. Not a scream of despair nor yell for help was heard as the man sunk, calmly, into the sand. The deceased hands and wilted body were cloaked in silt, as were their innards. The lungs, which had been miserably struggling for so long, had at last been greeted by the sweet hand of death as they collapsed, and the heart was flooded with relief as it was finally allowed to put a halt to its unredeeming beating. At last, the melancholy body was no more. The struggling had stopped. Time no longer brought despair over the man's shoulders. He was at last relieved. The last thing that remained to be consumed by the desolate sand was the straw hat, which struggled to keep its curved edge. And atop it sat the withered paper, and on that, the 5 figures, their happiness lost to the passage of time. And that's all. I hope you enjoyed the story. At the end of the video, I'll have a playlist to all the other stories I've written, and down below, I will have a link to the PDF of the story if you just like to read it on your own. So, thank you all for watching, and as always, have a great day, everyone.